In the autumn of 1851, within a narrow hollow of the Blue Ridge Mountains in western North Carolina, 31 children from a single one-room schoolhouse passed through a gap in the ridge on a clear Tuesday morning and were never seen in that state again. 6 days later, 4 emerged from the woods, barefoot, silent, with hair turned gray at their temples. The other 27 remained, in one official form or another, missing for 175 years now. What the county ledger recorded as a weather incident, what the church recorded as providence, and what the 4 survivors refused to speak of, until the last of them died in a state sanatorium in 1928, constitutes a story that the county itself tried 3 times to conceal. A monument that once stood at the entrance to the hollow was torn down in 1889. The school building was burned in 1902. The land was sold and resold until no living person in the valley could point to where the children had gone. Before we continue the account of Ashcom Hollow, please subscribe to this channel Some Music and turn on the notification bell. And in the comments, tell us which state or country you are listening from tonight, because what you are about to hear was recorded in a diary that a granddaughter passed to a historian in 1971, and the contents of that diary have never before been read aloud. To understand what happened on the morning of October 21, 1851, one must first understand this place. When the settlement of Ashcom lay in a fold of the Blue Ridge, about 30 miles west of the nearest real town, which at that time was Morganton. It was not a town in any sense recognizable today. It was a scattered locality of about 40 farmhouses, a single Presbyterian meeting hall that also served as a school on weekdays, a blacksmith shop, a mill on Pigeon Creek, and a general store run by a widow named Prudence Halsey. The people who lived there were of Scots, Irish, and German descent. Most were second or third generation of families that had come from Pennsylvania via the Great Wagon Road in the 1780s. They grew tobacco and corn in the bottomlands, kept hogs in the woods, and distilled a thin whiskey for which the tax collectors had not yet found reason to climb the ridges. Winters were harsh, with snowdrifts on the high passes sometimes blocking the road to Morganton for weeks at a time. Summers were green and hot, the air so thick with humidity that laundry hung on a line at dawn would still be damp at dusk. From all accounts that have come down to us, these people were devout, wary of strangers, and possessed of long memories. They did not forget slights. They did not forget debts. And they did not forget, though they did not often speak of it, what the elders had heard from those before them about the land that lay above the creek. The hollow itself, the one into which the children walked, lay about 1.25 miles east of the meeting hall, along a trail that followed the north bank of Pigeon Creek and then broke southward between 2 ridges. On the only surviving county map from 1847, it was called Ashcom's Hollow, after the first family to settle the valley. By 1851, it was more often called by an older name, one that the original settlers had borrowed from a poorly understood Cherokee word, and which, as far as anyone could translate it, meant the place where the land remembers. The Cherokee themselves, Some Music, had been removed from the region in 1838 during the removal, and whatever knowledge of that land remained passed to the settlers as fragments of warning. Children were not permitted to go up that hollow after dark. Hunters avoided it in late autumn. Women did not go there to gather galax or moss, even though the shaded coves along the creek yielded both in abundance. A man named Josiah Vaught, who settled the farm nearest the mouth of the hollow in 1821, nailed a wooden cross to a beech tree at the trail's entrance in 1829 and told his neighbors that it was meant to mark the boundary of a certain kind of land, though he never said what kind. When questioned, which happened rarely, he would only say that the man who had sold him the Southern 40 in 1824 An elderly German named Hagenbeck, who had lived in the valley since 1798, had pointed to the beach on the day of the sale and said "Hische Musik" in the halting English of his old age. You do not cross that mark at dusk, and you do not send a child across it alone. Not for anything, not for any price. Hagenbeck died in the winter of 1827 without further explanation. Vaught waited 2 years before putting up the cross, and he put it up, he said, on the night when the wind from the hollow woke him for the 3rd time in 2 weeks, and he could no longer lie in his own bed and listen to it. The schoolteacher in Ashcom that year was a young woman named Evangelina Trout. She was 24 years old, the daughter of a Methodist circuit rider from Salisbury, and she had come to the settlement in the spring of 1850 music on a 1-year contract that was renewed in the spring of 1851 for a 2nd year at a salary of $90 a year, paid half in coin and half in valley produce. She was slender, fair-haired, and, according to descriptions left in 2 separate letters written by her contemporaries, possessed of a quiet authority that surprised the older men of the settlement. She did not, as her predecessor had, defer to the parents of her older students. She did not soften her speech for the deacons, as the itinerant preachers who passed through did. She was, one of the Ravenel men wrote to his brother in Charlotte, an educated woman who made the mountain men nervous, which is to say, she knew what he did not, and did not pretend otherwise. She lived with Widow Halsey in a small room upstairs above the store. She was engaged in correspondence music with a young seminarian named Cornelius Brim, who was studying at Princeton Theological Seminary in New Jersey, and she kept a small leather diary that she filled almost every evening by tallow candlelight in the room above the store. It is this diary, preserved by chance at the bottom of a chest, passed down through generations, and finally given to a graduate student at Chapel Hill in 1971. That is the central document of what we know about what happened. According to a census she conducted herself in September 1851, the children she taught numbered 33. Their ages ranged from 6 to 14. The oldest was a boy named Absalom Ravenel, the son of a tenant farmer, a tall, quiet 14-year-old who was said to read aloud from the King James Bible to his younger sisters in the evenings in a steady voice that surprised visitors. The youngest was a girl named Comfort Pettigrew, who had turned 6 only in August, and who, according to Miss Trout's diary, came to school clutching a small rag doll she called Susanna, which she would not set down even during lessons, until the older girls convinced her that Susanna was tired and wanted to sleep in her lap. Among the others were 2 sets of twins, the Akin girls, Mercy and Prudence, age 11, the Stroop boys, Cullen and Cassius, age 9, and cousins, the Trasks, Phineas, who was 8, and Elihu, who was 10. There was also a girl named Verity Pellegrin, who stuttered, and whom Miss Trout tutored separately after school hours. There was a 9-year-old boy named Thaddeus Orr who, as his mother later wrote, had such a fear of water that he would not ford the creek to reach school on rainy mornings, but would instead take a long detour over a footbridge. There was a girl named Patience Thibodeau, the daughter of a shoemaker, who had won a ribbon at the county fair in September for her embroidery. On the morning of the 21st, 2 children were absent. Cullen Stroop was home with a fever. Patience Thibodeau had been kept by her mother to help with the last of the apples. So it was 31 children who remained in the meeting hall when Miss Trout rang the small brass bell at 700 and began the lessons. The decision to take them into the hollow was her own, and she recorded the reason for it in her diary 3 days earlier. On the 18th, a traveling naturalist by the name of Dr. Emmerich Kohl, a Bavarian by birth, who had for the past 12 years been a professor of botany at a small college in Ohio, had passed through the settlement on the 15th and stayed with Widow Halsey for 2 nights on his way back east. At supper, he spoke of a rare plant, a species of orchid that the old Cherokee had called by a name he could not pronounce, which bloomed in late October in the shaded coves of the Blue Ridge, and which he believed, based on certain specimens music he had collected in the Smokies the previous year, might be found near Ashcom. He showed Miss Trude a small pressed specimen from his portfolio. It was, she wrote, the strangest flower she had ever seen. Greenish, white with veins of dark purple that appeared black in candlelight, with petals that seemed almost like flattened lips. As if the plant were made, she wrote, to speak. She was, according to her diary entries, captivated. She decided that a walk with the children, to collect the last of the autumn leaves, and perhaps find the orchid, would serve as a lesson in natural philosophy, worth more than a week of reading from the primer. She chose the hollow because it was the nearest cove with the deep shade and damp soil that Dr. Cole had described. According to her diary entries up to the 18th, she did not know about the cross on the beach. She did not know the old Cherokee name. She knew nothing of Hagenbeck or of Josiah Vaught's sleepless nights. If anyone in the settlement knew of her plan and could have warned her, no one did. Widow Halsey, who was interviewed by the schoolteacher's fiancé 4 months later, said she had assumed that Miss Trude meant to take the children only as far as the beach at the hollow's entrance, where she thought the orchid's music might grow just as well. When she realized, she said, that the girl intended to go further to the clearing where the spring rose, it was already dusk on the 21st, and by then nothing could be done. That morning the weather was clear and cold, the kind of late October morning in the southern Appalachians, when the first hard frosts have already come to the lowlands, and the leaves on the maples and hickories are at their brightest. There was frost in the shade, but the sun was out, a thin yellow sun that gave light but not much warmth. The children, when Miss Trude announced the walk after the morning prayer, "I need your help, children," said those who survived long enough to give interviews, were wildly happy. "We will go fishing." They were allowed to run ahead on the trail. They were told to stay within earshot. They carried small cloth bundles with their noon bread and apples, tied at the corners and slung over their shoulders with twine. Miss Trude walked behind with the 2 oldest girls, Mercy Aiken and a 13-year-old girl named Constance Galliard. The trail followed the creek, crossed it once on a log, and turned south into the hollow around 800. At 900 they passed by Josiah Vaught's cornfield, where Vaught himself was pulling the last ears, and raised a hand to Miss Trude as she passed, and who, he later said, did not think to ask her at that moment how far she intended to go. At 9:45 they passed the beach with the cross, and here the diary kept by Miss Trude herself falls silent for 6 days. The alarm in the settlement was raised only near dusk. Widow Halsey, expecting her boarder back for the afternoon readings, at 2 o'clock, first assumed that the naturalist walk had run long, and that Miss Trude might have decided to let the children eat their bread by the spring, and had lost track of the hour. At 3 o'clock she grew uneasy. She went to the meeting hall and found it empty. She went to the edge of the settlement and looked down the trail toward the hollow, but saw nothing. At 4 o'clock she had already sent a boy for Josiah Vaught. Vaught, who had been harvesting corn in his field, said he had seen the children go up the trail that morning, but had not seen them return. He climbed onto his mule and rode up the hollow himself, calling out. The hollow returned his voice in a flat tone, as cubs sometimes do, not an echo but a muffling, and no voice answered. He rode all the way to the clearing by the spring and saw, as he later said, only the small cloth bundles laid folded on a flat stone, and the cores of a few apples scattered on the moss, and did not stop. He was a grown man in a Presbyterian she music, and, as he said, not given to fancies. But there was a feeling on that clearing, he said, like standing too close to the edge of a cliff in the dark, and he turned his mule and rode away faster than he had intended, and did not look back. By full dark, there were 15 men with lanterns and 2 hounds on the trails. By midnight, there were 40. By the morning of the 22nd, the entire settlement had left the woods, and riders had gone to Morganton to fetch the sheriff. The women remained in the meeting hall and prayed. The blacksmith, a man named Wilkin Mulder, did not light his forge for 6 days. The gristmill stopped turning. The general store opened only to sell flour and salt. The Reverend Obadiah Ashcom, who was 63 and walked with a cane, went up the hollow with the rest and sat on a log at the edge of the clearing through the 22nd and 23rd and spoke to no one. Later, in a letter to his bishop, he wrote that he sat there because he believed at first that if he prayed without ceasing, he would be given a sign as to where the children had gone. He wrote that no sign was given. He wrote that late on the 23rd, he heard something he took to be children's laughter somewhere on the eastern slope, and that he rose, called out, and that the laughter stopped, and that no child appeared, and that he sat back down and wept for the first time since his wife died in 1839. What the search parties found, or rather what they did not find, was recorded in 3 separate accounts. A report was filed by Sheriff Cassian Verlander on October 27. On the 29th, the Reverend Ashcom, grandson of the first settler, wrote a letter to his bishop in Riley, and a longer manuscript was written years later by the schoolteacher's fiancé, Cornelius Brim, who came down from Princeton when word reached him and stayed in the settlement for nearly 4 months, trying to understand what had happened. All 3 accounts agree on the following. The children had gone perhaps say of a mile up the hollow. They had stopped at a small clearing, perhaps half an acre in size, where a spring broke through mossy rocks. There were signs that they had stopped there. Apple cores, cloth bundles left folded on a flat stone, their corners neatly tied, as if their owners had intended to retrieve them shortly. A small pair of blankets laid neatly beside them, as if their owner had sat down to rest and taken them off. A ribbon pale blue, of the kind girls used to tie their hair. A slate pencil unbroken. From that clearing, no further trace was found. No trail led out. The ground, though damp in places, bore no tracks leading off to the side. The hounds would not enter the clearing. The sheriff's report notes, with some embarrassment, that 2 dogs lay down at the edge and could not be persuaded to go forward, and one of them whined and bit the man who tried to drag him across the spring line. As the search continued for 11 days, men walked the ridges in pairs and threes. They beat the laurel thickets with sticks. They fired muskets at intervals to signal each other. They walked the creek 2 miles in each direction. They found a bent hickory branch that might have been broken by a child passing, or might not. They found in a rock crevice some 400 yards east of the clearing what one of the searchers, a man named Ephraim Kirst, described as a neat pile of small stones, 11 stones stacked as a child might stack them, which had not been there when the settlement's last hunting party had passed through that crevice in early September. Kirst, who had lost a 10-year-old daughter on the walk, took the stack apart with his hands. What he did not tell the rest of the company, and what his wife learned from him only on his deathbed in 1878, was that beneath the stack he had found a single plait of chestnut hair, tied with a scrap of red wool, and that the plait was his daughter's, and that he had taken it home and burned it in the fire that same night, because he could not, he told his wife, reported to the others. Let that sink in for a moment. 31 children and one adult woman walked into a half-acre clearing zone of a mile from a settlement of 40 families and simply ceased to be there. No blood, no clothing, no disturbance of the earth. The spring flowed as it always had. The leaves lay where they had fallen. If this story disturbs you as much as it does me, take a moment and let us know in the comments where you are listening from tonight. And if you're new here, please subscribe so you don't miss the second half of this. Because what happened on the 6th day, the settlement tried to forget for the next 50 years. The settlement grieved as isolated mountain communities grieve. There was no wailing in the streets. There were no bells. The women cooked food and carried it to the homes of the families who had lost children, and the men sat on their porches and were silent. On the evening of the 24th, a prayer meeting was held at which Reverend Ashcom read from the Lamentations of Jeremiah, and the families of the missing children were not in attendance. Not one. The Ravenels did not come. The Pettigrews did not come. The Eakins did not come. The Trasks did not come. A woman named Mehitable Cross, who lived 2 farms down from the Ravenels, reported that Thomasina Ravenel had sat on her porch all day on the 25th, not going home, not eating, not speaking, except once, when a man tried to lead her home, saying that she was waiting, because a mother knows when a child is to be born. And a child was drawing near. By the 26th, the search had dwindled to a few men walking the ridges in pairs. By the 27th, it had effectively ended. Sheriff Verlander rode back to Morganton. The settlement, the Reverend wrote in his letter, was a place where no one looked each other in the eye, because to meet another's gaze was to see there the same emptiness one carried within. On the morning of the 27th, at about 6:45, a woman named Sibby Larkin, who was drawing water from the creek, noticed movement on the opposite bank. There was a thick fog that morning, she later said, so thick that she could not see the other side of the creek until she was almost in the water. She set down her buckets and went closer. 4 children stood in the shallows, knee-deep in the water, facing the current. They did not move when she called out to them. She waded in, the creek so cold she could feel it through her boots, and took the nearest by the hand, and it was a boy named Thaddeus Orr, who was 9-che music, and he did not look at her. His hair, which had been brown, had turned white at the temples. The other 3 were an 11-year-old girl named Mercy Aiken, an 8-year-old boy named Phineas Trask, and the oldest 14-year-old Absalom Ravenel, who was missing 2 front teeth that had been there on the morning of the 21st. Her music, Sibby Larkin carried them and brought them to the settlement, and, as she later said, none of them resisted. They were neither cold nor warm. Her music, they did not shiver, they did not cry. Their bare feet had no scratches from the stones of the creek bed. Their clothing was the same as they had worn into the hollow 6 days before, and it was clean, as if it had been washed, ironed, and put back on. It was this last detail, Sibby Larkin later said, that she would remember until her own death in 1894. The clothes were clean. After 6 days missing in the woods, the clothes were clean. The 4 were separated and placed in 4 different houses, under the care of their own families, where their families survived to receive them. The Ravenels had both parents of Absalom. The Trasks had Phineas's mother, his father having died of dysentery music in 1847. Mercy Aiken was placed with her parents and 4 surviving siblings, though her twin Prudence was not among those returned. Thaddeus Orr was placed with his father, as his mother had died of childbed fever in 1845. Her music physicians were summoned. The nearest doctor was in Morganton and did not arrive until the 29th. During those 2 days, the children did not speak. They ate when food was placed before them, slowly, without visible appetite. They slept when they were led to sleep. They went where they were led. They did not respond to their own names. They did not respond to the names of their siblings, nor their parents. When Thomasina Ravenel sat with Absalom, holding his hand, weeping, and asking him repeatedly where the others had gone, young Absalom stared at the wall and did not answer. And when at last, at the end of a long day, he turned his head toward her, she later said, she immediately wished he had not, because his eyes were not his eyes, and what looked out of them was not her son. And she knew in that moment, she said, that her son would not return, no matter how long she waited on the porch. When the doctor arrived, a man named Percival Cleve, who had trained at the University of Pennsylvania and who had been chosen for this call precisely because he had a reputation in the eastern counties as a specialist in unusual cases. He examined them one by one, his notes preserved in the archives of the North Carolina Medical Society, because he considered the case important enough to write up a paper he never finished or published. Described the 4 children as in perfect physical health. No bruises, no wounds, no signs of exposure or starvation. Their weights corresponded to what their families said they had weighed at the beginning of the month. Their clothing was the same as on the morning of the 21st, unchanged, not even soiled. Their hair at the temples had turned gray in a stripe about an inch wide on each side, as if painted. Their eyes, he wrote, tracked light but not faces. Their pulses were slow, in Absalom Ravenel's case, remarkably slow, 52 beats per minute, which for a 14-year-old boy he considered abnormal. They did not blink at a bright lamp held near their faces. They did not react to a sudden pistol shot fired by his assistant in the next room. An arrangement made without the family's knowledge, a test he later regretted. They were not catatonic, he wrote, in any clinical sense he recognized. They were elsewhere. It was this phrase he used in his notes. They were elsewhere, and whatever had taken them there had brought back in each of their bodies something that was not yet quite skilled at being a child. Over the following weeks, 3 of the 4 began, to varying degrees, to return. The first was 8-year-old Phineas Trask. He began to respond to his mother on November 11, 21 days after his return. She was sitting by his bed. His mother wrote in a letter to her sister in Rowan County, and singing a hymn she had sung to him when he was an infant, the one about the Lord as her shepherd. And he turned his head and said quite clearly, "Mother." And then he began to cry. And he cried, his mother wrote, for 3 hours, and she held him and she cried too. And when he stopped crying, he fell asleep. And when he woke the next morning, he recognized her again, and he knew his name, and he knew the day of the week she told him. But he did not know what month it was, and he did not know why his father was not there. And he did not know, his mother wrote, that he had ever gone up the hollow at all. He seemed to believe, hear music, from what she could piece together from his questions, that it was still summer. He seemed to believe he had been ill. By December, he was speaking in short sentences. By spring, he was attending the girls' school in Morganton, where his parents had moved to music, because his mother remarried in February to a carpenter named Lemuel Quince, who agreed to take the boy. And outwardly, he was a normal child, though he would not sleep in a room without a lamp, would not eat apples, and would not, under any circumstances, walk east of the house he lived in, because east, as his stepfather noticed, was the direction in which the mountains lay. Mercy Eakin returned more slowly. She began to speak in March. She was withdrawn, her family said, and would stand for long periods at the window, looking down the valley. And she had a habit of asking, from time to time, whether the singing had stopped. No one in the house knew what she meant by the singing, and she would not explain. "Why don't you speak?" And when in April her mother pressed her and asked directly whether she meant the hymns the family sang at evening prayer, Mercy shook her head once and said, "No, the other singing, the one that goes on." And then she was silent for the rest of the day. She was the only one of the returned who spoke, however indirectly, about what had been in the hollow. Her mother, who kept a diary, recorded 7 separate occasions over the next 3 years when Mercy referred to what she called the singing. In each case, Mercy used the definite article, as if the singing were a matter of common knowledge, which her mother said unsettled her most of all. The assumption on the child's part that her mother knew as well. Mercy married a farmer named Cyrus Palmer in 1859, bore 4 children, and lived to be 71. She told no one else about the incident, not even her husband, until the last week of her life, when she said only this, which her daughter Patience recorded in the family Bible: "We could not keep up with the others, and they went on without us, and we fell behind ourselves, and I do not know whether it was a blessing or a curse." Thaddeus came back broken. He spoke in May, word by word, mostly words naming objects he saw in the room. By June, he was forming sentences. In August, without warning, he stopped speaking and did not speak again until the following spring. When he resumed, he seemed at first an ordinary 11-year-old boy. He attended school. He helped his father in the field. He was seen in the summer of 1853 laughing with hay music, another boy on the road by the store. But in the autumn of that year, on the anniversary of the walk, he fell silent for a long period that lasted all winter. And this pattern, his father wrote, became the shape of his life thereafter. In autumn, he did not speak and seemed not to hear what was said to him. In spring and summer, he was almost as he had been before. His mother wrote in a letter to her sister, sent that first autumn after his partial recovery, that he was 2 boys, the one who had gone up the hollow, and the one who had returned, and that neither was fully hers. He never married. He worked as a field hand on his father's farm until his father's death in 1868. In 1871, at age 29, he was committed to the state asylum after an incident in which he walked in his autumn silence 10 miles east of his farm to the old Ashcom settlement, which by then was nearly abandoned, and was found at the entrance to the hollow, his hands on the beech tree that had once borne the cross and that had by then fallen. He died in the asylum in 1889. Absalom Ravenel, the oldest, never returned. He was silent. He did not respond to his name. In the opinion of Dr. Cleve or the 3 other physicians who examined him over the next 12 years, he suffered from no identifiable disease. He had a good appetite. His sleep was regular. His vital signs were stable. He simply did not engage. He lived in the upstairs room of his parents' house until the end of their lives. And his mother, Thomasina, cared for him as if he were an infant, dressing him, bathing him, reading the Bible to him in the evenings, though he gave no sign of hearing the words. His father could not look at him, and so from 1854 ate in the kitchen and slept on a cot in the barn. When they both died within a month of each other, during a flu outbreak in 1863, he was taken in by his uncle Barak Ravenel, and when Barak died in 1871, he was placed in the state sanatorium in Morganton. He lived there another 57 years. To the staff, he was known as the Silent Man. He ate what was placed before him. He walked the grounds when walked. He was silent. He did not write, though over the decades a succession of physicians tried to teach him to hold a pencil. He did not draw. He gave no indication that the staff could notice of the existence in the world of any person but himself. He seemed not to see a mirror when held before him. He did not startle at loud noises. The only thing he did, and which was recorded in the admission logs over 57 years, was this: on October 21 of every year, between 300 and 500, he would stand at the window of his room, whichever window he was given that year, and look east. He would stand for exactly 2 hours. At 5 o'clock, he would turn, sit on his bed, and resume his customary silence. He did this every year from 1871 to 1927. He died on February 3, 1928, at the age of 91. At the time of his death, he was the oldest living patient in the sanatorium. The day nurse who was with him, a woman named Imogene Darnell, recorded in the ward log that at 300, the silent man opened his eyes, which had been closed since morning, and in a perfectly clear voice said 3 words. He said, "They are coming." Then he closed his eyes and died. What happened on the clearing? Understand that this question consumed the settlement for a generation. It consumed the schoolteacher's fiancé, Cornelius Brim, who in the winter of 1851 and 1852 interviewed every adult in the settlement and left behind a manuscript of some 400 pages, unpublished, now in the rare book collection of the University of North Carolina. It consumed the Reverend Ashcom, who preached a sermon each year on the anniversary of the disappearance, until his death in 1868, each year urging his flock to examine themselves for the sin that, as he some music believed, had brought the judgment, though he could never name what sin it was. It consumed Dr. Cleve, who returned to the settlement 3 times over the next 20 years to examine Thaddeus, and Absalom Ravenel, and who died in 1881 with a drawer full of notes he had never been able to organize into a single paper. It consumed Josiah Vaught, who slowly went mad through the 1850s, and who was found hanged in his barn in the spring of 1861 with a note pinned to his music shirt that read only, "I should have cut the tree down. I should have cut it down in 1830. Forgive me." And it consumed, more quietly, every historian and folklorist who has encountered the case since. Evangelina Trut's diary, when it surfaced in 1971, was thought by the graduate student who received it to be the final answer. It was not. Just when we thought we had seen it all, the records in Ashburn deepen. If this story gives you chills, share this video with a friend who loves forgotten American history. Hit the like button to help us grow, and subscribe so you don't miss the parts of this story that almost never left the archives. Because what the graduate student found, and what he did not publish, and what he eventually burned, has only one surviving copy. And that copy sat in a box in a reserved garage of a professor in Durham until 2019, when his daughter sold the contents of the garage at an estate sale, and a local historian bought the she music box for $12. Here is what was in the diary. Evangelina Trut wrote in it every evening from March 17, 1850, when she arrived in the settlement, to the night of October 20, 1851. The early entries are exactly what one would expect from a young woman in her first post. Observations about her pupils and a small loneliness. Letters written to Cornelius to which no reply had yet come. Descriptions of the weather. Reflections on the sermons she heard in the meeting hall on Sundays. By the summer of 1851, the entries begin to record her walks. She seems to have begun walking alone on Saturday afternoons for exercise and writing to clear her head of the week's noise. She walked the trail along the creek. She walked the ridge to the north. She walked, beginning in August, up the hollow. The first entry in which she mentions the hollow is dated August 9. She writes that she went only as far as the beach with the cross, that she was curious about the cross, and that she asked Widow Halsey about it upon her return. And she was told that it was an old marker, and that Vaught had placed it there, and that its meaning was forgotten. Miss Trut notes with the mild condescension of a young educated woman toward rural superstition that she assumes the cross was meant to ward off some fancy of an older generation, and that it is a pity the settlement cannot find a way to be rid of such reminders of a less educated time. On August 16, she records her first walk past the beach to the clearing by the spring. She writes that it is a beautiful place, that the light falls through the high leaves in columns, that the spring water is so cold it hurts her teeth, and that she sat for nearly an hour on the flat stone beside it. She writes that while sitting, she heard a sound she first took for wind. But when she listened more closely, it resolved into something like voices, as if a group of people were speaking at a considerable distance, just below the threshold of understanding. She writes that she was not afraid. She writes that she assumed farmers were working somewhere beyond the ridge, that the cove served as a sounding board, and that she was catching their conversations carried on the air. She writes that she returned home in good spirits and slept soundly. On August 23, she returns. The sound is there again. She writes that she is beginning to doubt her previous explanation. The sound has no rhythm of conversation. It has, she writes, the rhythm of singing, though she cannot name the melody. It rises and falls. There is what she takes to be words, though she cannot make them out. This time she stays longer, perhaps 2 hours. She writes that as she leaves the clearing, she feels a strong desire to stay, and that for several hundred yards along the trail, she has the sensation of having forgotten something important, and that she must turn back. Entries through September record further walks, increasing in frequency. By mid-September, she is going up the hollow 3 times a week after school, while the light lasts. She writes about it less than one might expect. She begins to describe the sound as the music of the cove, later as singing, and by the end of the month simply as it, with the familiarity of private language. On September 29, she writes that she believes the sound to be some natural phenomenon, perhaps related to water flowing through rock, but that she would like to consult a scientific man about it. She does not yet know that Dr. Cole will appear in the settlement 2 weeks later. There is no turning back. On October 6, she takes the first 2 children with her. This is what the graduate student noticed, and what the schoolteacher's fiancé, who never saw the following pages of the diary, did not know. If we hope to see spring, she had already taken children before. On October 6, she took Absalom Ravenel and Mercy Eichen, the 2 oldest in her school, and she took them. She wrote, because she wanted to know whether the singing, as she now consistently called it, could be heard by others. She wrote that she had begun to fear that she was imagining it. She wrote that she wanted to test it scientifically. One Saturday, she took the 2 children up the hollow, led them to the clearing, and asked them to sit on the flat stone and tell her what they heard. They heard it. Both of them heard it. Mercy, she wrote, was at first disturbed and asked if they could leave. But Absalom was entranced. Absalom sat on the rock for a full hour and listened. And when at last they began to return along the trail, he asked in a voice Miss Trout described as dreamy whether they could come again. She agreed. They came again on the 13th. This time Miss Trout brought 4 children, Absalom and Mercy, and 2 others, a boy named Gideon Pettigrew, who was 10, and a girl named Verity Pellegrin, who was 12 and who stuttered. She writes that Gideon heard the singing at once and laughed, and that Verity also heard it and did not laugh. Verity, she writes, asked a question Miss Trout had not expected. Verity asked whether the singers were inside the rock. Miss Trout, not knowing how to answer, said the sound was only an echo, that it had a natural explanation, and that there was nothing to fear. Verity, who usually stuttered, spoke that day on the clearing. Miss Trout writes, without any stutter at all, and asked her second question, which was, if they are not inside the rock, Then where are they? Miss Trout does not record her answer. She records only that they stayed another quarter hour, and that she had to take Verity by the hand and lead her out, and that she had to promise Verity they would return, because otherwise Verity would not have moved. On the 20th, the day before the walk, she writes an entry that the graduate student, 37 years later, would recognize as the center of the whole mystery. I will read it now exactly as it was written, without editing, so that you may perhaps hear it, as she wrote it at 10:30 on the night before the last morning of her life. I have been to the clearing by the spring 3 times, and 3 times I have heard the singing, and I cannot tell whether it is the singing of children or something that has learned to sound like children. Dr. Cole asked me on the evening of the 16th whether I had heard anything unusual in the hollow during my walks. And when I answered yes, he did not seem surprised. No, he said that there are places on the ridge where the rock lies in a formation he called resonant, and where wind, water, and cavities beneath it produce at certain hours and in certain seasons a sound that uneducated people mistake for voices. He said that the old Cherokee knew these places and marked them, and that their traditions about them are nothing more than the natural tendency of the human mind to personify what it cannot explain. He said there is nothing harmful in them if one does not go at dusk, when hearing is less reliable and imagination more so. I asked him if he had ever been to such a place, and he said no, that he is a man of science, and that he prefers to read about them. I confess I did not tell him that I had already taken children into the hollow twice on Saturday afternoons, because I wanted them to hear what I heard. I did not tell him that on the second Saturday, Absalom Ravenel said to me, after we had been on the clearing perhaps a quarter hour, that the singing had words, and that the words were inviting the children to come closer. But only the children, and that the voice would not speak to me, because I was too old. I did not tell him that little Verity Pellegrin said without her usual stutter, that the voices were behind the spring, not above it, and that they were under the stones, and that they were, she said, lonely. I did not tell him that when we left that day, the 2 younger children did not want to go, and that I had to carry Gideon Pettigrew out. I did not tell him any of this about Dr. Cole, because, I confess, I was not ashamed to admit that I had taken the children into the hollow without the permission of their parents, and I was aware that to confess it would mean reproach. I have decided to take them all together tomorrow on a school outing approved by the committee, so that we may all listen as a class and discuss what it is. For I am convinced that Dr. Music Cole is right, and that the sound has a natural cause, and that the children's fancies about it will dissolve in the light of understanding. I am sure this is the right course. I write this at 10:30, and will try to sleep. Tonight the wind is in the eaves, and for a moment, I thought I heard the singing again. Though we are 1.25 miles from the hollow, which of course is impossible. This is the last entry, though the diary continues with blank pages to the end of the book. Miss Trout, as has been said, was never seen again. Her body was never found. Her fiancé, Cornelius Brim, in his long manuscript, records that her room at the boarding house was left exactly as she had left it on the morning of the 21st. That her bed was made, that her hairbrush and small mirror lay on the washstand, and the diary lay open on the table by the candle. Open not to the entry of the 20th, but to the entry of August 16, the day of her first walk to the spring. He does not explain why the diary was open to that page. He does not explain why the candle had been allowed to burn down when Miss Trout's habit, confirmed by Widow Halsey, was always to blow it out before leaving the room in the morning. The diary itself, after its return east in March 1852, was sent to Widow Halsey, who kept it at the bottom of a chest in which she stored her winter blankets. She passed it on after her death, in 1868, to her niece, who passed it to her daughter, who passed it in 1971, after cleaning out her mother's house, to a graduate student at Chapel Hill named Hollister Vance, who was at that time researching antebellum education in the southern Appalachians, and who had written to the daughter asking whether the family had any school records from her cousin's grandmother. What Hollister Vance understood after reading the diary, and what he confirmed by traveling to the site himself in the spring of 1972 with a geologist colleague from the university, was the following. In that hollow, on the clearing where the spring rises, beneath the surface there is a limestone formation containing a number of narrow cracks. When the wind blows from the north, the creek is full, and the air pressure drops before a front. Those cracks do indeed produce a sound. The sound is continuous, soft, and has a pitch in a range that the human ear, particularly a child's ear, whose hearing extends further into higher frequencies than an adult's, interprets as voices at a middle distance. In certain weather, it resembles singing. In other weather, it resembles conversation. In still other weather, it resembles the quiet crying of infants. The geologist recorded the sound with microphones he had brought and played it back for Vance in a motel room in Morganton that same evening. And then Vance wrote in his notes that when he closed his eyes and listened to the recording, he almost believed that the sound contained his own name. This is, as Dr. Cole said, a natural phenomenon. It occurs in several places in the southern Appalachians. In itself, it is not dangerous. But Vance also discovered something else. He found in the settlement records, kept in the county courthouse in Morganton, that there had been earlier disappearances. Not on the scale of 1851, but disappearances nonetheless. A hunter named Lemuel Gaither disappeared in the hollow in 1814. 2 children, a brother and sister named Isham and Dorcas Coggan, went missing from a farm on the edge of the hollow in 1833, and were found a week later silent and unresponsive, and both died within the year. A traveling peddler named Ezra Mays disappeared in 1844, his abandoned wagon found by the beach with the cross, the horses still in their traces. The peddler's account book open on the driver's seat to an entry for September 15, 1844, which was never completed. A mill worker named Caradoc Swain disappeared in 1829, the year Vaught set up the cross. 2 brothers, the Orchards, went into the hollow to hunt turkeys in 1801, and only one returned. And the one who returned hanged himself 3 weeks later. Vance compiled a list of 17 separate incidents in the hollow between 1789 and 1850. He noted that the pattern was not random. The incidents clustered in late autumn. They clustered in years following wet summers. And, most disturbingly, they clustered in years when the settlement's population increased, as if the hollow were responding to pressure or to opportunity. Vance also found in the Cherokee ethnographic records held at the Smithsonian Institution a reference to this place, translated not as the place where the land remembers, but more precisely as the place that keeps what it takes. He found a Cherokee prohibition recorded by an ethnographer named James Mooney in 1889 that forbade bringing children to the clearing under any circumstances, and in particular, not bringing them in numbers greater than 1. The ethnographer did not understand the specificity of the prohibition and dismissed it as local superstition. Vance, with the diary before him, understood its specificity exactly. 1 child at a time, the tradition held, never more. Miss Trout had brought 2 on October 6. She had brought 4 on the 13th. She had brought 31 on the 21st. Vance concluded, and it was here that his academic advisor, Professor Lanford Tremaine, warned him against publication, that the sound on the clearing was not the cause of the disappearances. It was a lure. That something else in that place, something he did not name in his notes, because he could not find a name for it, used the sound to attract prey. And the prey it preferred, as the tradition implied and the pattern confirmed, were children. The evidence for his interpretation was circumstantial. It rested on the Cherokee prohibition, on the pattern of disappearances, on the condition of the 4 returned children, and on the testimony of Absalom Ravenel's mother, that what looked out of her son's eyes was not her son. And on one further piece of evidence he found in the state sanatorium records when he was granted access to them in 1974. That evidence changed everything. He found that on the afternoon of February 3, 1928, at the very moment Absalom Ravenel spoke his last 3 words and died, a patient in a ward on the other side of the building, a woman named Orpha Quill, who had been committed with hysterical melancholia in 1917, and who was 63 at the time of her death, also died. Her death certificate listed natural causes. The ward log, however, recorded that she died in exactly the same manner as Absalom, that she had been silent and unresponsive to all stimuli throughout her 10 years in the sanatorium, and that at 300 on February 3, she opened her eyes and in a clear voice spoke 3 words. The same 3 words, "They are coming," and closed her eyes and died. Vance traced her history. She had been committed in 1917 from a boarding house in Asheville, where she had lived alone under the name Orpha Quill for 24 years. She had appeared in Asheville in 1893. The boarding house keeper said she had come up the mountain road on foot, alone, dressed in rags of a child's dress, though she was then 48 years old. She could not give her name. The name Orpha Quill was one the boarding house keeper had chosen for her, so that there would be something to enter in the ledger. When she arrived, she carried with her one small object, which the boarding house keeper kept with her belongings until her commitment. It was a pressed flower. It was a greenish, white orchid with dark purple veins that appeared black in candlelight. It was a species that did not grow in North Carolina and had never been catalogued by any botanist. It was the flower. On the evening of October 15, 1851, Dr. Emmerich Cole showed Miss Truitt in the upstairs room of the Halsey store. Vance traced the woman's history further. He traced her by facial features on her death photograph. He traced her by dental records kept in the sanatorium. Eventually, he traced her by the shape of a small birthmark on her left wrist, noted by the admitting physician in 1917, which matched exactly a birthmark described in Evangelina Truitt's diary in an entry from the spring of 1851, in which Miss Truitt described her youngest pupil, a girl named Comfort Pettigrew, who was 6 on the morning of October 21, and whose rag doll Susanna was found 4 days into the search on the flat stone by the spring, where she had left it, when she went further into the clearing than anyone else. Orpha Quill was Comfort Pettigrew. She had walked into the hollow at age 6 in 1851 and walked out of it at age 48 in 1893, 42 years later, carrying a flower that did not exist in the world, and then lived another 35 years in silence, and died at the very moment Absalom Ravenel died, speaking his same last words. Vance's manuscript ends there. He did not know what to do with what he had found. He wrote in a private letter to his advisor, which Tremaine kept and which was in the garage box sold in 2019, that he felt as if he were looking through a window at something one should not look at, and that he had begun to dream at night after reading the sanatorium records of the clearing he had visited only once. He burned the manuscript in 1978, and music, the surviving copy, the one bought at the estate sale in 2019, is a carbon copy he had made in 1976 for his advisor and forgotten about. The historian who purchased it, a woman named Martha Wexler from the State Archive, also did not publish it. She has no intention of ever doing so, she said when I contacted her about music in the summer of 2024. She believes, as Vance did, that the clearing is still there. She believes the spring still flows. She believes that on fine days, the singing can still be heard. And she believes, though she will not say exactly why, that the other 27 children who went into the hollow in 1851 are still, in some sense she does not wish to articulate, unknown. She has been to the site once. She will not go again. One more detail, and with it we come to the end of what can be known. In 2006, a hiker on the Appalachian Trail, which runs about 3 miles from the former Ashcom Hollow, reported to a park ranger that he had lost his bearings in fog, left the trail, and come upon a small clearing with a spring, about half an acre in size. He said he heard something he took to be children singing, though he saw no children. And he sat on the flat stone by the spring, listening, as he thought, for about 15 minutes, trying to locate the source. When he finally got up and found his way back to the trail, 2 groups of other hikers passed him heading north, and each of them, when he asked, gave him a different date. When he reached the ranger station later that day, he learned that 4 days had passed since he had left the trail. He did not remember where he had been during those days. In his backpack was a small pressed flower, greenish, white with dark purple veins that, under certain light, appeared almost black. But he did not remember picking it. The ranger took the flower, promised to send it to a botanist for identification, and filed a report. The flower was never identified. The ranger retired in 2011. The report is in a file at the ranger station. The following year, the hiker's hair had turned gray at the temples. He lives in Ohio. He does not answer phone calls. This mystery shows us that the past does not always stay buried, and that some places are best not visited not because they are haunted in any way, as old stories acknowledge, but because the land itself, the geology, the weather, and the deep time of the mountains can be indifferent to us in ways we cannot fully understand, or because whatever the mountains keep, whatever it may be, has its own hunger, its own patience, and its own slow measure of years. 4 children came out of that hollow in 1851. 27 did not. 1 returned 42 years later, changed beyond recognition, carrying a flower that should not exist, and on a small private cemetery in western North Carolina to this day, a memorial stone stands with no name, only a date. October 21, 1851, and 1 word, lost. Set up in 1951, exactly 100 years after that walk, paid for by a descendant of the Ashcom family, because she believed that someone should remember what the county had tried 3 times to forget. She told the stonecutter, who told his apprentice, who told a local reporter, who wrote it in a notebook that was never published, that she had been haunted all her life by a feeling she could not name. A feeling that came over her most strongly in late autumn. A feeling as if somewhere just below the threshold, she could hear a group of voices singing, calling her name, asking her to come closer. Only children, they said. Only children. But from the day she learned this story, she was never a child again. And so she was safe, she said, from whatever it was. And she hoped that by raising the stone, she might somehow pay off a debt that her family, her county, and her country owed to those 27 who went and never returned. What do you think of this story? Do you believe the graduate student Hollister Vance was right about what lived on that clearing? Or do you think the whole story has a simpler and sadder explanation? A well-meaning teacher, a geological curiosity, a community that could not bear the weight of what it had failed to prevent, and a woman who walked out of the mountains half a lifetime, later with a flower in her hand and a silence in her throat that no physician could unlock. Leave your comment below and tell us what you think really happened in Ashcom Hollow. If you enjoyed this story and want more forgotten American stories like it, subscribe, hit the notification bell music, and share this with someone who loves dark mysteries. See you in the next video.